recently there was a young man who was pastoring a mega church in the Florida area, and he here recently committed suicide. My granddaughter, she called me here recently as well, and asked me about on 9/11. You saw those persons who leaped to the end of their lives from buildings as the building was being engulfed. And my granddaughter, her concern was about their eternal salvation and where they would be ultimately. But as you know, there has always been, or you may or may not know, there's always been a lot of controversy around believers and suicide. Now, what you ultimately believe happens to be, it depends on your background. If you are part of Catholicism, you're Catholic, you may believe that that person ends up in purgatory or something of that nature. If you're Armenian, most Pentecostals, or persons, excuse me, who don't believe in eternal salvation, don't want to swipe a broad brush up on everybody, but if you're Armenian and you don't believe in that persons are once saved or always saved, then certainly a person who would commit suicide would probably be seen as a person who is not going to be eternally with the Lord. If you're Calvinistic, you believe in this extraordinary grace, you probably believe there's a possibility of a person that they could commit suicide and be with the Lord. Well, then that comes to me. What am I? I'm Christ-based. What else would I be? So this question about believers and suicide, I think it can be answered, in my mind anyway, as I share with others about this, and as I shared with my granddaughter, about what God has for those of us who are in Him. And that's the issue. It's in Romans 8, very briefly, Romans 8:39. Paul said this in this extraordinary book, the book of Romans. For those of you who know, it's one of the most, it is probably the Rembrandt of New Testament theology. Those who don't know, it is a lot of verses that you probably have heard. If not, let me read this for you about the love of God. I am convinced, Paul said, reading from the New Living Translation, that nothing can ever separate us, and there's the key, separate us from the love from God's love. Neither death nor life, nor angels nor demons, neither our fears for today nor our worries about tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. What is that? What does Paul seem to be saying there? He is saying that notwithstanding our fears and our worries, one of the things that's often said about a person who would commit suicide, that they did not have enough faith in the Lord, that He could remedy, that He could heal that person's circumstance. I mentioned the pastor who recently, young pastor recently committed suicide, and apparently there was a circumstance where he had to resign from his church because of inappropriate activity. Okay? But the key in this text is nothing can separate us. Now, who is the us? That's the question that has to be answered, because if you're part of us, nothing can separate us. So let me go to that next step and talk about us. This is what I believe being Christ-based. Jesus used the term, so I'm going to use it, in John chapter 3, about being born again. The us are those persons who are born again. Now, the term that he used with Nicodemus, and I'll turn there very briefly, just make sure that we are citing the appropriate place. Forgive me if we have not. That just happened when we've been around God's text all the time. But as in Nicodemus' experience, you can go there and read it for yourself, who comes to him. And of course, he is a person who is a religious expert, as it were. And a man named Nicodemus, John chapter 3. After dark one evening, he comes to Jesus. It is in this experience that he is looking for an answer to relationship. And Jesus says you must be born again. Look at that process. Born no person in the world, when I was born, I didn't say to my mama and daddy, y'all get together. Please get together so I can come 9 months later. Our birth came from the acts and actions of our parents. So Jesus, using that illustration, wants to make it clear to Nicodemus and to us that in order to be in a relationship with God, you have to be birthed spiritually by your spiritual parent. Born again is a parental operation. It is not my operation. If I'm born again, if I am the us that Paul talks about in Romans 8:39, it's because God birthed me. And if he birthed me, through life, nor death, nor sickness, nor worries, nor even my failure of faith to the degree that I would commit suicide, would separate me from him ultimately and eternally. But the key is whether or not he birthed me. How do we know whether or not he birthed me? Sure, I begin to represent him. I begin to act like him. I begin to look like him. But Paul mentioned in Romans 8:39 that there are worries, that there are stresses. And when we fail, and we all do, we may not fail to the degree of suicide, but we all fail. And all that person did was just failed at the point of believing in this particular experience that God could deliver him, her, or whomever from that specific circumstance. But in my mind, looking at what Jesus said about being birthed, the question is, if God has truly birthed me, I will always be his child. I will always. I cannot stop being his child. One day my daughter was here. She's in her 30s and had rain antlers on her head. You know, it's just about Christmas time. I said, I don't care what you do. You can put antlers on your head. You could change your name, but you're always going to be Steve and Bobby's daughter. We're just hopeful and prayerful that each and every one of us will act like the God who birthed us. But the question is, that's the only question, whether or not we've been birthed. That's the only God, and we know that. But I'm not at a point of failure in my faith. That's a sin. But it doesn't cast me out of his love. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord receive you in every way. And when you respond to people, I pray that you would show them this video. It says we cannot be separated. We cannot. Nothing can separate us. Thank you so much. May God bless you.